Welcome to this episode of One Book at a Time, the Manchester University Press podcast. Time to slow down, consider the issues, learn the histories and exercise your brain in the open air of considered judgment and frontline thinking. And help us change the world one book at a time.
Historian Asa Briggs coined the phrase shock city about Manchester's Victorian splendour. In the 1980s, the shock for visitors was just how far the city had declined. But then something happened.
So here we are outside what used to be the front entrance of the Hacienda Club, which opened in 1982 as a lab experiment in popular culture, according to its founder Tony Wilson.
Author Andy Spinoza has a theory about the revival of the city. Did it really start with just one building?
And today it's actually the front door of an apartment scheme called the Hacienda Apartments.
Andy came to Manchester in the late 70s. He set up City Life Listings magazine after graduating university, before becoming a freelance journalist and then editor of the diary page of the Manchester Evening News. Leaving there in the late 90s, he became a PR supremo, a position which saw him become involved in the city's booming property sector.
And in the ground floor, embedded into the building, is an estate agents who have used the classic Ben Kelly hazard warning stripe design for a huge poster that reads "Hacienda, your local property experts. Sell, buy, let, rent, mortgage services and more."
One of the questions Andy asks is, did this seemingly improbable boom just start with a nightclub, opened in a city centre, then on its knees?
And what clearer sign really that what started as this artistic bohemian gift to Manchester's interesting community is now the epicentre of a property boom.
My name is Matthew Frost, and in this episode of One Book at a Time, we take the author to four emblematic buildings, each with its part to play in Manchester Unspun, pop, property and power in the original modern city. We start in a pub, one of the city's oldest.
We're in the rear of the Britain's Protection, the 200-year-old pub with associations with Peterloo. Manchester before it was, or in the early stages of it becoming the Victorian shock city. This sort of venerable old pub was much beloved of Hacienda clubbers before they went into the Hacienda around the corner on Whitworth Street West.
Looking at the back window of the Britain's Protection, that's a wonderful building opposite, isn't it?
That was cheerleaders.
Right.
This building here, there's a door on the side that leads down, and that's where, as diary editor, I went to see Muhammad Ali being chaperoned by Max Clifford. There was this huge crowd of people gagging for a drink who were told they couldn't have a drink till Ali, as a strict Muslim, had left the building. And after about an hour and a half of him signing autographs, doing photographs, he left. And they were all, "Hey, cheer." And then he came back down the stairs, doing that sort of James Brown, I ain't done yet routine. And he did this 3 more times. And then when he finally left in a taxi, someone said, he's definitely left. And the whole place erupted in a huge cheer, which they could probably hear around the corner at the Hacienda, because they could finally have a drink. It was Saturday night, after all.
So the landscape around the Britain's Protection has changed quite a bit in the 40 years of your book, hasn't it?
Looking over the tops of the 4-storey Victorian building in front of us, we can just see emerging the 58-storey tower at Deansgate Square, which is a 4-strong complex of skyscrapers which will be joined not far away by a further 6 that are already gone through planning and in construction.
And the development just doesn't seem to stop around here, does it?
Well, in between the building where Cheerleaders was, a tacky sports bar, and where we're standing now is the British Protection pub garden. And on that space, between the back door of the British Protection and the building over the road, we are faced with the prospect of a 28-storey tower on this really postage stamp sized footprint. The space we're talking about really has got maybe space of 5 or 6 cars and a bit of a beer garden behind the pub, and that's it. I think it's just symptomatic of the free-for-all that some see Manchester's residential property scene has become.
Manchester unspun. You describe it, Andy, very accurately, I think, as examining the strange chemical reaction of pop culture, property and politics.
Those are the areas that I've been involved with for 40 years, since I arrived in Manchester in 79. The property, for which buildings, architecture, entranced me because there was a sense of a fall in civilization. There was a charisma to the place that was like a high Gothic drama, really, especially on a Sunday when the city was pretty empty of people, apart from a few students, like me and my friends, and we would come to the British Protection, but not before we had wandered through the ruins of the smashed up former Manchester Central train station. We'd walk all the way down to Pomona Docks, and there was a sense of grandiose civilization whose time had passed.
Manchester Unspun is an autobiography, a musical and sociological history, an investigation of the huge transformation of the city. But how much would you say that the city has grown? How its development has grown? Is it exceptional?
City centre population when I came to Manchester in 79 was probably about 500 people, and now the nearest snapshot we can get to that is probably 60,000 people in that area, and probably 250,000 people if you take in what might be called the outer city centre. So those areas have a city centre character as well, so it really is quite a transformation, and one I don't think that London and nationally has quite been recognised yet.
Ground floor. We are just getting into the lift of the Hilton Hotel to go to the 23rd floor of this tower that was completed in 2007. It's a crisp, clear, cold day, and we're looking to see some fabulous views.
So here we are in Cloud 23, 23rd floor of the Hilton Hotel, and it's one of the buildings that stands out.
Yeah, it's distinctive shape, which some people have compared to a mobile phone shape. It's become almost emblematic, really, of the new Manchester. Manchester's never really had that kind of one single structure that stood in for the city. We're looking out, in fact, at the 4 huge towers of Deansgate Square, so it's almost as though Beetham Tower has been usurped by these new upstarts that are taller and shinier and make even more impact on the eyesight and the landscape.
Next to Deansgate Square, you've now got 3 or 4 more buildings going up, which are looking like they're over 50 stories.
I believe there are another 6 of that kind of height, over 50 certainly. They overlook the nearby Hume neighbourhood, which 40 years ago would have seen 6 sort of bull rings in a style that was supposedly modelled on the Georgian crescents in Bath. So those crescents and 12 other towers made up Hume.
Just next to the Liverpool Road train station, you have the factory, that new building there. So what is the significance of that, Andy?
The significance of the Factory International, as it's now been named, is the almost ultimate expression of where Manchester's leaders see the city going. They see the need for Manchester to have something different that attracts leaders, thinkers, influencers from around the world, and they want to be saying there's something interesting going on in Manchester. The building itself could be said to lack some visual appeal. It's been described to be variously as the head of a giant robot, or less flattering perhaps, a giant beetle or cockroach.
So we've just been talking about Hume, looking at Hume over on that side, and then you look out of the side window and you've got Factory International. It's full circle, isn't it?
Yeah, how did we go from, Busman's social club in Hume, putting on punk nights called the Factory Nights, to the £211 million Factory International art space opening in 2023 with probably £100 million from a Conservative government? Everything in between those two bookends is the subject of my book.
For those who don't know it, Andy, could you explain just sort of what the Hume Estate was, that brutalist, concrete, so-called, award-winning masterpiece of the 60s and 70s, and what it became in Manchester?
It was a failed housing experiment, modernist in extremis. By the time I lived in Hume in 1980 for 2 years, all the so-called normal people had been moved out. It was an unpleasant place to live. There was lots of crime and deprivation. It became totally a bohemian quarter of squatters, students, musicians, artists, and it was a pretty mind-mashing place to live. We used to call it Planet Hume because it just did seem to be in another world entirely.
So, do you see the redevelopment of Hume as one of the beginnings of the redevelopment of Manchester?
Hume's important in two ways. One, it was the location for Factory Records punk gigs in the Russell Club. More importantly, from a sort of urban planning point of view, in 1992, the Conservative government and the Labour Council collaborated in depth on a complete redevelopment of the old failed estate, and using what's called the Hume Design Code, built a new neighbourhood that is probably the template for the redesign of all failed council estates across the country.
Is it fair to link the redevelopment of Hume to the redevelopment of the city centre?
It is fair to link the two, because not only was it so close to the city centre and the university that its influence, if you like, spilled over into those nearby sites, but it was a successful cooperation between Labour Council and Conservative government that set this kind of partnership working model in place that then came into play with the Manchester bomb in 1996. In many other projects since that date, you can date it from the Hume partnership.
So, Andy, we've left the Britain's protection, and we've just been listening to the bells of the hidden gem, which is no longer quite so hidden, and we're standing in front of the marvellous Christo-like clad town hall. So what can you say about this?
Well, it's clad in an installation art style covering because it's undergoing a £350 million restoration, a sort of a future-proofing from top to bottom. You can't really see the grandiose building by Alfred Waterhouse. That was a testament to Manchester's commercial power and status in the late Victorian age. For most people, they would see this building as the kind of centre of power in Manchester, and so it is in the city of Manchester. But in 2017, we enjoyed devolution, Greater Manchester Combined Authority led by Mayor Andy Burnham. That whole operation is based up the road on Oxford Street. And my book does look at one or two episodes of some friction between the age-old city council and the new sheriff in town, if you like, with Andy Burnham.
So what happened in the 1980s, where you had a Labour-led council but it attracted such investment from a Tory government.
So in the 1980s, Manchester was bracketed along with London, Liverpool and Sheffield as rebel authorities taking on Conservative government. But in 1987, when the Conservatives won another election, they basically did a U-turn, and Graham Stringer's on record as saying, he wrote to the government and in his words saying, "We lost, you won, now we want to work with you." And ever since, Manchester has been firmly welcoming of investment. So it starts with the Hume City Challenge of the mid-80s. Then you had the IRA bomb. You then had Urbis and the Millennium Quarter, which came out of the bomb-damaged area. And all these strengthened relationships between Manchester and not only the politicians, who come and go, but the civil servants who tend to stick around and be very, very influential talking to government. And this process, eventually was to lead to the devolution deal delivered almost outside of Conservative government to give Manchester quite a jaw-dropping set of devolved powers, which now is setting the template for both main political parties, saying this is how we're going to give legitimacy back to areas that have been failed by central government policy over the last 100 years.
George Osborne had a great effect on Manchester, if only because of the Northern Powerhouse. Yep. Northern Powerhouse, I think, became a joke very, very quickly, but it's still there and it still has had an effect.
Northern Powerhouse was the phrase on the lips of many a politician from 2016 when George Osborne and his people conjured it up. He announced that Manchester was the capital of the Northern Powerhouse, and he had very close relations with the powers that be in Manchester. He could see the business-friendly approach of the city centre, and his civil servants would have given him great confidence that here was, the council that was deserving of devolved governance, and devolution followed. I mean, Northern Powerhouse now is basically a historical curio that no one takes seriously because funding wasn't, mainly for transport improvements, wasn't really followed through. It was since kind of overridden by an even vaguer mantra of levelling up, which is also now is treated with great derision by the political landscape. So it was interesting for its time, and I would argue that Manchester exploited the Northern Powerhouse for all it was worth, but it wasn't worth much more than what we got out of it.
So Graham Stringer, who was the leader of the council and is now a Manchester MP, but more famously Richard Leese and Howard Bernstein, the leader of the council and the city's chief executive, they must take a huge amount of credit in the regeneration. Why was their partnership so influential?
I think you have a coming together of two incredibly smart, tenacious and motivated individuals. I'm talking Leese and Bernstein. Yeah. Leese, technically the boss of Bernstein, leader in charge of the civil servant. Bernstein, the master property brain, who's able to put deals together, bring together financiers, developers, always with the determination to create leisure, commercial, residential activity in Manchester. It's a very common phrase in Manchester's politics and property that Sir Howard Bernstein was a property developer disguised as the town clerk, which was another one of his roles. And together they were a formidable partnership because, in my experience, they never contradicted each other and they were rarely photographed together. Richard handled the politics, and that showed us to the commercial powers that here was a council that was united. The politics was not going to undermine the development. The new leader, the new chief executive of Manchester, are very much committed to continuing the same policies that Leese and Bernstein laid down, which is a lot of development, a lot of tall towers, and the increasing expansion of the city centre.
So, and it's inevitable we'd end up here, isn't it? Outside this door.
Yeah, so this is the where the double doors used to be, with Fact 51 template inside the doors. You've got now what is Hacienda Apartments front entrance. The queue would go round the side here where we see now an estate agents, and that queue was almost like a community in itself waiting for the club to open. People would sell fanzines and probably less legal wares to the people in the queue. Cars would park right along this corner. Memorable to me because one night I saw a police undercover sting of a drug deal going down with vans and coppers and mayhem, and it's memorable for the outside of Hacienda just as much as the inside.
Tony Wilson went on record about the Hacienda, of course, just saying, yes, let it go.
Yeah, he said, he was quizzed about it on TV, why didn't he want to save the building? His quote was, "Nostalgia is a disease. Cities change, things change. Let's not get sentimental about a pile of bricks." I do wonder whether beneath that there was a sadness that because he couldn't change the fact the building had been sold and was due to be demolished for a charity auction. Property market had taken over, what was a failed enterprise. Council was encouraging redevelopment, so there was only going to be one outcome.
We're going to talk about the Hacienda. I mean, there is a sense of Hacienda fatigue with the 40th anniversary, etc. But you say in the book, it could never, of course, begin with just one eccentric and experimental building. And yet it did. I think this is a very telling line. Can you sort of expatiate on that a little?
Yeah, but let's deal with the fatigue first, because quite rightly, people have got bored with the superficial, one-dimensional picture of Hacienda that has emerged mainly as a result of the Manchester explosion. The likes of Sean Ryder being seen as the archetypal Hacienda customer, at the club's height, and he had a part to play, of course, as did Happy Mondays. But Hacienda's origins were from factory records, and those people behind factory records could have taken their money and gone and lived in Cheshire or even the Isle of Man, become tax exiles. They didn't. They put the money made from Joy Division's records into a huge nightclub that was poorly designed for the audience at the time. They announced on the original membership forms for the new clientele in 1982, intention to create a sense of place. So it's right up there in the stated aims of the Hacienda that this was for Manchester. It was their contribution to making the city great again, however absurd and that sounds. And of course, Tony Wilson, one of the founders, did often sound absurd when saying every city needs its cathedrals, and this is ours. New York and Paris have got theirs, and it's a cathedral to pop culture. All that was 7 or 8 years before it did take on cathedral-like characteristics with the rave scene. But I think reimagining what Manchester could be as a city, we have a paper trail. It's in the very DNA of the club's origins. The Situationist essay that Hacienda name was taken from is all about the imaginative power of cities rather than efficient city planning and property values. It's about sparking the imagination. And Wilson and Gretton and Saville and Hannett and Erasmus knew that essay inside out and very overtly referred to it with the name. So you've got all this going on. The future had arrived in Manchester, but not very many people seem to want to be a part of it. The numbers were very low. Had some big gigs there, but generally it lost, a fortune. It's an open matter that, it probably lost £2 million in the first 3 or 4 years, and they still ploughed their money into it. And of course they did Shanghai New Order into continuing to invest in it. And all that happened before this kind of revolution in popular culture happened, which then bizarrely seemed to make sense of the space, and all of a sudden they had the perfect nightclub for dance music, all people of different levels. It was a visual experience, and the punters became part of the show.
Tony Wilson, of course, is, I loved your description, that compelling ball of confusion. He is a central figure in the myth of Manchester of the last 40 years, isn't he?
Where do we start with Wilson? He always said, when forced to choose between fact and the legend, print the legend. And I've got a little nod to that in my preface with a quote from Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. I love the quote because it basically says, we don't actually know our recent past as well as we think we do. If we think of the last 20 years of the 20th century, which is the first half of this book, what a completely different society we had. I mean, look at the city, what a completely different city we experienced. And I think if I've done anything, it's to remind the reader of some very recent chapters in our history that are almost in danger of being forgotten. It's that civic history that needs to be communicated to people who may be arriving in Manchester today thinking maybe this is how it's always been. No, the changes have been momentous, and I don't think they would have happened without those popular culture movers and shakers making them happen.
Would you say that it is more attractive today? And certainly when I came up here, which is shortly after you, there's something about the excitement of it being rebuilt. But do you have any nostalgia for that time?
Well, people coming here now for different things. They're coming for work, but they're coming because they're attracted by a different Manchester. I was reading about Manchester and seeing photographs in the New Musical Express and the other music papers, which acted as a kind of alternative tourist board for alienated youth like me who wanted somewhere kind of unusual and a place to hang out and a place to be where I think it expressed our own angst and psychology at the time. I think people are coming to Manchester today to make their fortune, to be entrepreneurs. Digital economy is really booming, and there's a sort of a critical mass of business activity here that kind of puts London to shame, in that London's digital economy is pretty much of a hyped thing. There's a lot of money there, but people are coming to Manchester for a community. It's a sense of community, I think, that you don't see in the capital city.
Can we overstate the importance of the Hacienda?
Well, Manchester Unspun takes the premise that, would Manchester be as booming a city with the devolved political powers it has and with the global investment appeal it has today if Factory Records and the Hacienda had not existed? We can't say whether without the Hacienda Manchester would have been a worse city or a better city. We can say that it would have been a very different city, and not only in the place itself, which brought the interesting community out to play and to meet in ways perhaps that we don't quite see today when a lot of us are sitting at our screens communing virtually, but also in those people, what they went on to do, and those people's roles in various aspects of what has made modern Manchester. So, short list: Peter Saville, factory director, was hired to revive the city's brand with the original modern brand proposition. Hacienda manager John Drape was hired to launch Spinningfield's corporate office district. Sacha Lord, who promoted his first nights as a young entrepreneur, is now Andy Burnham, the Greater Manchester Mayor's right-hand
man on all things leisure and hospitality. And there are other examples. So without the Hacienda, would we have the city that we have today? I don't believe that we would. And all those examples are detailed and more besides in the book.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Manchester University Press podcast, One Book at a Time. The song, Watching the Hydroplanes, was courtesy of Tunnel Vision. If you like what you've heard, please check out the MUP website, www.manchesteruniversitypress.uk, where you can find and order a copy of this book and many others like it. Don't forget to follow us on all the major social media platforms and subscribe to our newsletter for 30% off all of our books.